Chapter 1. The battle for Arcturus 4 had begun as all battles do. Chaotic, explosive, and unpredictable. But none of them had prepared Elias Trent for what he saw when the sky cracked open. Above the military base, the Zorkari warships hovered like dark harbingers of doom. They didn't just attack with guns or missiles. They had something far worse: fire. Elias watched as the first flare of heat struck the ground. The explosion echoed across the barren landscape, and the earth trembled beneath his boots. His hands gripped the controls of the command center, his fingers twitching with the familiar sensation of stress. But this was different. The Zorkari were known for their advanced technology, but this was something they had never encountered before. What the hell are they using? His voice was strained as he spoke into his earpiece, the crackling static barely covering the urgency in his tone. "Not sure, sir," replied Lieutenant Mara Voss, the sharp, methodical officer at his side. "But we've never seen fire weapons like this. It's controlled. Too precise." Elias clenched his jaw. The Zorkari weren't just attacking, they were showing off. Their flames were laser-focused, scorching the earth in impossible patterns. It was as if they had learned to command the very element itself. His eyes narrowed. The humans had always relied on technology, strategy, and sheer willpower. But this was something different. A loud blast echoed in the distance, followed by a shockwave that rattled the base. Elias barely managed to stay on his feet, his hand bracing against the console. The Zorkari weren't just testing their weapons. They were overwhelming them, pushing the humans back with an unimaginable level of precision. "Activate the secondary defense grid," Elias barked, pushing past Mara. "We have to buy time for the airstrike." "Sir, the secondary grid isn't ready," Mara protested. "The Zorkari are already overwhelming the first line. If we deploy that now, we risk losing our position before the airstrike even gets here." Elias shot her a look, eyes fierce and unyielding. "We don't have a choice. They're not going to wait for us to be ready." The air was thick with heat. The ground under their feet was beginning to glow red, the Zorkari's flames carving through the terrain like hot knives through butter. Every attempt to retaliate felt like a misstep, too slow, too predictable. The fire wasn't just a weapon, it was a statement. The Zorkari had mastered something humanity never could. "Get the flamethrowers ready," Elias ordered as he stormed out of the command center, his boots crunching the burnt earth beneath him. The team he had assembled to defend the base was already in disarray. Soldiers scrambled for cover, seeking shelter from the hellish barrage above. Their own flamethrowers, mere shadows compared to the Zorkari's controlled infernos, sputtered and failed against the relentless onslaught. Elias moved quickly, scanning the area for any remaining unscathed team members. He spotted Captain Sam Jordan crouched behind a shattered building, trying to adjust his weapon. "Sam," Elias called, his voice cutting through the rising smoke. "We need to hit them hard. Right now." Sam didn't need further orders. He nodded, his face smudged with dirt and sweat, eyes hardened by years of war. "Understood. You're not thinking of going full force, are you?" "I am," Elias replied without hesitation. "We don't have time for half measures anymore. It's now or never." The human soldiers, armed with the basic flamethrowers they had used in training, were struggling to combat the Zorkari firestorms. Their weapons lacked the intensity needed to penetrate the Zorkari's shielded lines. Elias watched as one of the soldiers fired a burst of flame, only to see it swallowed by the Zorkari's larger, more concentrated blaze. The Zorkari weren't just enemies. They were symbols of everything humanity feared: the loss of control, the loss of mastery over the forces they had worked so hard to understand. But Elias refused to bow. If the Zorkari thought fire was their element, they were about to learn the hard way that humans, too, could bend fire to their will. He turned to Sam. "We're testing something new. It's our only shot." Sam's brows furrowed. "That's insane. It's still unstable. You know that, right?" Elias didn't flinch. "If it works, we win. If it doesn't, then we lose. Either way, we're out of options." He grabbed the flamethrower prototype from a nearby crate. It was a bulky, unstable thing, nothing like the precision tools the Zorkari wielded. The human-made weapon had a fuel source that could generate a high-temperature blaze, but it wasn't refined yet. Still, it was their only hope. The team gathered around Elias, each soldier knowing the stakes. They had been preparing for this day, this moment. Every test, every tweak had led them to this point. "Remember the training," Elias said, eyeing his soldiers one by one. "We've been through worse. We can handle this." With no further words, Elias lifted the flamethrower and turned toward the Zorkari lines. The moment the flame shot out, it was as if time stopped. The air shimmered with the intense heat, but it wasn't just heat. It was control, raw and untamed. Unlike the Zorkari's elegant bursts of fire, this was brutal and unpredictable. The flame spread in wild arcs, erratic yet terrifying. For a split second, it seemed to hang in the air, almost as if the weapon was alive and fighting back. But then, the Zorkari responded, their fire lashing out, hotter and more directed than ever. Their response was swift, and Elias barely dodged the blistering heat as it scorched the earth where he had stood moments before. "Retreat," he shouted, signaling the team to fall back. This fight wasn't over yet, but they had bought themselves some time. As the team retreated back to the command center, Elias's mind raced. The flamethrower had worked, sort of, but there was more to it. The Zorkari's fire had been perfect, a blade too sharp for any weapon they had to counter. What they needed wasn't just fire. It was something far more unpredictable, far more lethal. They had mastered the art of fire. But humanity? Humanity was about to show them what it truly meant to burn. The dust from the previous day's battle had barely settled when Elias Trent returned to the command center. His face was covered in grime, his uniform singed in places where the Zorkari fire had come too close. Despite the defeat, there was something different in the air, a tension mixed with hope. He knew, deep down, that they had seen a spark, a glimpse of something that could change everything. Inside the command center, the atmosphere was heavy. Mara Voss stood over the central console, her eyes glued to the display as she scanned the battlefield's satellite images. Elias could feel the weight of her gaze before she even spoke. "They're regrouping," she said, her voice cold and methodical. "They're analyzing our every move. We're not dealing with regular enemies here. The Zorkari are calculating. They'll adapt quickly." Elias nodded, rubbing his temple. He didn't need to hear it. He knew. The Zorkari weren't just advanced technologically. They were surgical in their approach, and they had fire. But the more Elias thought about it, the more he realized their fire was their weakness. Fire, in the hands of anyone, could be turned against them. "We need something more than just flamethrowers," he muttered to himself. His mind raced through every possibility, every option they had left. "We're going to make it our advantage," he said, finally turning to Mara, his voice resolute. "We're going to create a fire that's beyond their control." Mara looked up, eyes narrowed. "You're talking about a counterattack with a weapon we don't even understand fully yet. And you want to use it against an enemy that controls fire better than we do." Elias met her gaze. "Exactly." She shook her head, clearly torn between loyalty to her commander and the gnawing worry of pushing an unstable weapon into the hands of soldiers. "The prototype is too unstable, Elias. It could backfire in ways we can't even predict. We're gambling with lives." "Then let's make sure the gamble pays off," Elias replied. "We need to act now. The Zorkari know what we're capable of. If we let them regroup, they'll come at us with something worse." Mara hesitated. She knew better than anyone that time was a luxury they couldn't afford. The longer they waited, the more they gave the Zorkari the chance to refine their fire-based weaponry. But still, the thought of unleashing an unstable weapon weighed heavily on her. "Fine," she said, finally, her voice laced with reluctant determination. "But we need a plan. No more improvising. We go in prepared, or we don't go at all." Elias nodded. "Agreed. Let's get to work." The following hours were a blur of frantic activity. Engineers and soldiers scrambled to refine the flamethrower prototype, tweaking the fuel source, adjusting the ignition mechanism, and reinforcing its containment systems. If there was a chance, this was it. Elias stood in the center of it all, his mind running through every variable. He couldn't afford to hesitate now. They had to succeed. There was no retreat, no second chance. The Zorkari were learning, adapting, and soon they would outmaneuver them again unless they acted first. Mara approached him once the final adjustments were made. She handed him a helmet, her eyes filled with resolve but still tinged with concern. "We're ready. Let's hope it's enough," Elias replied, taking the helmet and securing it in place. He felt a sense of finality in that simple motion, as though putting on the helmet sealed his fate and that of his men. The battle began at dawn. A thin layer of mist hung over the rocky terrain, giving the air an eerie stillness. The Zorkari warships had reappeared, their sleek, black silhouettes cutting through the sky like vultures. It was clear they had returned with a new strategy, their weapons charging with an almost palpable energy. Elias's team moved quickly, positioning themselves at strategic points along the ridge that overlooked the enemy's encampment. The plan was simple: hit them where it hurt, at their base of operations, and make them rethink their advantage. "We deploy the flamethrowers first," Elias said into his comms as his team took position. "Give them a taste of their own medicine. But don't go full force yet. We need them to think it's just another skirmish." The soldiers nodded, each one ready for what was to come. The Zorkari had no idea what they were about to face. The first flame erupted from Elias's weapon, and a torrent of fire shot forward, consuming the rocks and sand in front of him. For a moment, it felt surreal, like something out of nightmare, but Elias focused. This wasn't about control. It was about unpredictability. As the fire arced and spread, it created chaos. The Zorkari immediately retaliated, their fire cutting through the air with deadly precision. But something was different. The Zorkari fire seemed to struggle, faltering in the face of the wild, untamed flames from the humans. Elias's heart raced. The Zorkari were good, but they hadn't accounted for the volatility of human ingenuity. Every burst from their flamethrowers created a ripple of heat in the air, almost as if their fire had a mind of its own, twisting and writhing in unexpected patterns. The Zorkari forces faltered. Their perfect, controlled flames were no match for the brute force of human-made fire that spread without warning, leaping from one target to another, engulfing their ships in moments. "Keep the pressure on," Elias barked, his voice cutting through the calms as the battle intensified. He could see the Zorkari starting to panic. They were retreating, regrouping in an attempt to focus their fire. But they couldn't stop the chaos. Elias's soldiers advanced, relentless, their own flamethrowers roaring with fury. The Zorkari attempted to counterattack, but the unpredictable, uncontrolled human fire was too much. Their shields flickered as they tried to block the intense heat, but the fire didn't follow the rules. It spread, it flared, and it burned through the Zorkari's defenses. Elias knew this was their moment, the turning point. The Zorkari had underestimated the sheer force of humanity's will to survive. This wasn't just fire. This was the manifestation of their defiance, their ability to adapt and strike back when the odds were stacked against them. As the Zorkari lines began to crumble, Elias allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction. They had done it. For the first time in the battle, it felt like the humans were in control. But the war wasn't over yet. This was just the beginning. He turned to his team, a steely resolve in his eyes. "Move forward. We finish this now." And with that, they surged forward, the flames of humanity leading the charge. You said, Chapter 3. The battlefield was littered with the remnants of what had once been the pride of the Zorkari military. Their ships, twisted and scorched, lay scattered across the rocky expanse. What was once a perfect, controlled show of power had now been reduced to chaos, a chaos brought on by a single force: human ingenuity. Elias stood at the edge of the smoke-filled battlefield, his eyes scanning the wreckage. The Zorkari were retreating, regrouping, but they weren't defeated. Not yet. The fight was far from over. The war had only just begun, and Elias knew that what had worked today, human fire, was just a glimpse of the arsenal they still had to wield. Mara approached him, her boots crunching on the gravel. Her face was smeared with soot, her uniform torn in several places. Despite the hard exterior, Elias could see the subtle hint of relief in her eyes. The first victory felt like a long-awaited breath of fresh air. "That was something," she said, her voice still carrying the sharp edge of concern. "But we've only scraped the surface, Elias. The Zorkari won't fall so easily. They'll be back with a vengeance." Elias didn't reply immediately. His eyes narrowed as he observed the retreating enemy. Mara was right. This wasn't over. But today had proven something important. The Zorkari were not invincible. Their technology, their mastery of fire, could be turned against them. The key was to keep pushing them to the edge. "We'll have to be ready for their next move," Elias finally said, his voice low but resolute. "But for now, let's regroup. We got a chance to gather some intel while they lick their wounds." Mara nodded. "I'll have the scouts on it. They'll find their weak points. But be careful, Elias. The Zorkari don't take failure well. If they regroup, they'll come back stronger." "I know, but we've learned something crucial today," Elias said, turning away from the wreckage. "Humanity is capable of more than just surviving. We can fight back, and we can adapt faster than they ever thought possible." Back at the command center, the tension was palpable. The soldiers moved quickly, organizing the debris from the skirmish, while technicians worked tirelessly to analyze the data. The fire-based weapons they had used were effective, but Elias knew that to truly defeat the Zorkari, they would need to go further, something even more unpredictable, even more human. Elias leaned over a holographic table, watching as the latest scans of Zorkari movements flickered across the surface. Their fleet was already reassembling, but they seemed different, more cautious, almost as if they had learned something from the humans' counterattack. "They're adapting too quickly," Mara observed from beside him. "Their forces are more spread out now. They're preparing for another push, but this time it won't be so easy." Elias clenched his fists. "They'll be more prepared, sure, but they'll still underestimate us. We've only just begun to fight on our terms." Mara raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean by that?" Elias didn't respond immediately. He didn't want to reveal his full plan just yet. The human advantage wasn't just in brute force. It was in unpredictability. The Zorkari might have mastered fire, but they hadn't yet learned how to deal with the chaos humans could bring to the battlefield. And chaos was exactly what Elias planned to unleash. "We'll strike again, but this time we'll go for their command center," he said finally, his voice thick with determination. "We take out their leader, break their chain of command. If we can do that, the rest of their forces will fall apart." Mara's eyes flickered with doubt. "It's a bold move, Elias. We don't even know where their leader is. And without more intel, it's a risk." "We have enough," Elias said, his gaze hardening. "We know enough to make a calculated strike. And that's all we need." Hours later, under the cover of darkness, Elias led a small team of elite soldiers toward the heart of the Zorkari encampment. The moonlight was dim, but their movements were swift and silent. The mission was clear: infiltrate, eliminate, and disrupt. As they crept closer to the Zorkari command center, Elias signaled for the team to stop. They had reached a cliffside that overlooked the enemy's base. The sprawling facility below was alive with activity, Zorkari soldiers moving in synchronized patterns, unaware of the human presence just beyond their line of sight. Elias's mind raced as he studied the base. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This mission wasn't just about defeating an enemy. It was about proving to the universe that humans were a force to be reckoned with. "We make our move now," Elias whispered to Mara, who was crouched beside him. "We take out their outer defenses first. Once that's done, we head straight for their command center." "No hesitation," Mara nodded, her hand resting on the hilt of her weapon. "Understood." The team moved as one, slipping through the shadows and taking out Zorkari sentries with ruthless precision. Elias's heart pounded in his chest, but his mind remained focused. Every step brought them closer to their target. Finally, they reached the outer perimeter of the command center. Elias took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the area for any signs of movement. The tension was unbearable, but they had come too far to turn back now. "On my mark," Elias whispered, his voice low but commanding. 3, 2, 1. With that, the team surged forward, launching a coordinated attack that incapacitated the outer defenses. The Zorkari responded quickly, but it was too late. The humans had already breached their perimeter. Inside the command center, Elias's team split up, moving with deadly intent toward their objective. Elias knew they had only one chance to strike, and he couldn't afford to fail. At the heart of the facility, they found their target, a Zorkari leader surrounded by a group of officers. Elias's heart skipped a beat. This was it. He raised his weapon, taking aim, when a voice, sharp and commanding, echoed through the room. "You think you can destroy us so easily, human?" The leader's eyes glowed with a fierce light. "You've only just begun to understand the power we wield." Elias's finger hovered over the trigger. This wasn't just about fire. It was about the will to fight, something the Zorkari had underestimated. "I don't need to understand your power," Elias said, his voice steady. "I just need to beat you." With that, the final shot rang out, and the Zorkari leader fell. The command center was theirs. As Elias stood over the fallen leader, his mind raced. This was a victory, but it was just the beginning. The human forces had struck the Zorkari command center with precision, but the victory felt hollow. As Elias stood in the quiet aftermath, looking out over the base now littered with Zorkari casualties, a sense of unease crept up on him. They had won a battle, yes, but the war was far from over. There was still so much left to do, and he knew better than to think this would be their final confrontation. Elias wiped the sweat from his brow and exhaled deeply. His hands still trembled slightly, a reminder of the adrenaline that had surged through him during the fight. He'd never been one to hesitate, but every kill weighed on him. Even in the chaos of war, he couldn't escape the human part of him that questioned the cost of victory. "We did it, Elias." Mara's voice broke through his thoughts. She stood beside him now, her face smeared with dirt, but her eyes bright with a fierce determination. "The Zorkari are on their heels. They won't know what hit them." Elias gave her a brief nod, his eyes scanning the ruins around them. "We've only hit a small portion of their forces. They're regrouping. I'm not convinced they'll be as easy to break next time." Mara looked at him, her expression hardening. "That's why we hit them hard, while they're still vulnerable. We've broken their leadership. The rest of them will scatter." Elias turned to face her, shaking his head. "That's not how the Zorkari work. They'll adapt, and they'll come back with more strength. They're not like us." Mara's gaze softened. "You're right. But we've proven something to them, haven't we? Humans are capable of doing the impossible, and we'll keep doing it until we win." He didn't respond immediately. His thoughts were already racing forward, considering their next move. They had to keep pushing, keep showing the Zorkari that humanity was not something they could easily crush. Back at the human command ship, Elias sat in the war room, staring at the holographic map spread out before him. The Zorkari had been quiet for the last few hours, and in that silence, he could feel the storm brewing. Their forces were already moving, regrouping across the planet's surface. The next wave would be more aggressive, better coordinated, and far more dangerous. "Intel from the front line, sir," a voice called from behind him. He turned to see one of the analysts approach, holding a datapad. "The Zorkari are consolidating their forces. They've called for reinforcement from their neighboring systems." Elias leaned forward, focusing on the data. His mind churned through the possibilities. The Zorkari weren't just reacting. They were strategizing, organizing. They were preparing for something big. He could almost feel the weight of their response in the air. "They're not just sending more troops," Mara said, joining him at the table. "They're strengthening their position. They've learned from their mistakes." Elias didn't look up, and they'll keep learning. That's why we need to stay ahead of them. The silence that followed was thick with the unspoken knowledge that the next step would be critical. This wouldn't be a fight of force anymore. It would be a game of wits, of misdirection. Elias had learned the hard way that victory wasn't always about strength. Sometimes it was about making the enemy think you were weak when you were actually stronger than they could ever imagine. "We need a distraction," Elias said suddenly, breaking the quiet. "We hit them where they don't expect us." Mara raised an eyebrow. "A distraction? You're talking about striking from behind." "Exactly," Elias replied. "If we can split their forces, they'll be forced to overextend. The Zorkari aren't used to dealing with uncertainty. They're methodical, rigid. That's their weakness. Mara crossed her arms. And what if they anticipate that? Elias smiled faintly. They won't. They think they've figured us out. But they haven't yet. Hours later, the human forces were moving under the cover of night, leaving behind the fortified positions to strike deep within the heart of the Zorkari supply lines. Elias led a team of his most trusted soldiers, each of them a master of stealth and subterfuge. The plan was simple: infiltrate, disrupt, and escape before the Zorkari could react. The cold air bit at Elias's skin as he crouched in the shadows of a craggy cliffside, watching the Zorkari convoys move below. The enemy was in full motion, sending reinforcements to the front line. What they didn't realize was that their convoy was about to become a distraction. "We're in position," Mara whispered in his ear. She was close behind, a silent shadow in the night. "Once we make our move, there's no going back." Elias nodded, his focus narrowing. "On my mark." The signal was given, and in a flash, the team was in motion. They moved with precision, planting explosive charges along the convoy's path. The Zorkari soldiers were too distracted by their mission to notice the small group of humans silently working their way through the shadows. The explosives would create a diversion, but the real damage would come afterward. Elias placed the last charge on a fuel tank, then stood and signaled the team to fall back. They retreated into the darkness just as the first explosion rocked the convoy. Fire blossomed in the distance, and chaos erupted. Zorkari forces scrambled, shouting commands and trying to regain control, but it was too late. The humans had already melted into the terrain. As Elias and his team disappeared into the night, he allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction. The Zorkari had fallen for it. They'd overestimated their ability to control the battlefield. Back aboard the command ship, the explosions had not gone unnoticed. The Zorkari were already shifting their resources to respond, but Elias was already preparing his next move. The attack on their supply lines had given them an opening, but there was still more to do. "We've done enough for now," Mara said, joining him in the command center. "They'll be reeling from a hit to their logistics, but we need to press this advantage." Elias leaned back in his chair, the weight of the mission heavy on his mind. "We need to strike now, while they're vulnerable. We've broken their momentum once, but if we don't keep them on the defensive, they'll regroup and adapt." Mara nodded in agreement. "It's time to bring the fight to them. Finish what we started." Elias's eyes hardened. "Yes, it's time to show them what it truly means to challenge humanity." The storm was only beginning. The war had reached its tipping point. Elias could feel it in the air, thick, heavy, and charged with anticipation. The Zorkari, once so confident in their dominance, now appeared fractured and shaken. Their rapid regrouping had not been enough to quash the damage the humans had inflicted. Every tactical move they made, every resource they threw into the fight, only seemed to prove one undeniable truth. Humanity was no longer a fringe force in this war. They were a new kind of threat. Inside the command room aboard the human flagship, the atmosphere was tense. Data streams flickered across the wall-sized screens, each one detailing the latest movements of the Zorkari forces. On the surface, the enemy was regrouping, but there was something else Elias noticed. A pattern. It wasn't just logistics or reinforcements. The Zorkari were consolidating their forces into fewer, but stronger formations. They were preparing for something massive. "We've pushed them back," Mara said, her voice cutting through the silence. She stood at the holographic display, her arms folded as she studied the data. "But I don't think they're ready to surrender." "They never will," Elias muttered, his gaze sharp as he processed the map. "But we've got them rattled. The question is, can we break them before they regroup completely? We don't have much time. They've consolidated their strongest units. I bet they're planning a counterattack soon." Elias nodded grimly. He had seen it before. Empires, no matter how technologically advanced, always had their limits. The Zorkari had underestimated humanity's ability to adapt and innovate. That had been their first mistake. The next one would be underestimating Elias himself. "Give me a report on the status of our fleet," he said to the officer at the console. I want to know how much we can afford to push forward. A few tense moments passed before the officer responded. Our fleet is at 80% strength. We've taken some losses, but nothing catastrophic. The rest of our forces are still active. Elias's mind raced as he formulated his plan. The Zorkari had thrown everything they had at them in the last few days, and now they were retreating, but not in disarray. They were making a calculated retreat to rebuild their strength. It was a dangerous move, but one that could still work in humanity's favor. The key now was to keep pressing the attack, not giving them a chance to recover. He turned to Mara. I want us to launch a two-pronged offensive. One unit will hit their outermost line, force them to split their forces. The other unit, our main force, will strike at their command center. This has to be decisive. We break their leadership, and the rest of their forces will fall apart. Mara raised an eyebrow. Bold and risky. That's why we have to do it now, Elias replied, his voice low but filled with resolve. If we wait, they'll regain their footing and we'll be back to square one. We hit them while they're still in disarray. Mara considered his words for a moment before nodding. All right, I'll get the team ready. You're certain about this? Elias smiled. When you're fighting a force as brutal as the Zorkari, there's no room for hesitation. The night was cold as Elias stood at the helm of the flagship, watching the stars stretch across the endless expanse. The hum of the engines beneath his feet was the only sound that filled the silence. He felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him, but he had no time for second-guessing. The war was no longer about what was safe. It was about survival. Captain, a voice broke into his thoughts. It was Mara, her face determined. The teams are ready. We move out in 5. Elias nodded and turned to face her. Make sure they know what's at stake. This isn't just about fighting. It's about showing the Zorkari that they can't win by simply overwhelming us. I'll brief them. No mistakes. Mara paused, then added, I know you're not one for speeches, Elias, but I think this is the time for one. He chuckled darkly. You're right, but there's no need for speeches. The humans have already shown what they're capable of. Now it's time to show them that we're just getting started. The first phase of the offensive was underway. On the planet's surface, the two human forces, one a diversion and the other the main attack, launched their assault. As Elias had predicted, the Zorkari split their forces. The diversion worked perfectly, drawing the enemy's attention away from the main strike force. The main force, led by Elias, descended upon the Zorkari command center, which was hidden deep within a mountain range. The battle was fierce. The Zorkari had entrenched themselves within their stronghold, but humanity's tactical superiority was undeniable. As the human forces advanced, they used the terrain to their advantage, striking swiftly and without mercy. The Zorkari fought back with all the power their technology could muster, but it wasn't enough. They were cornered. Elias fought alongside his men, his mind focused entirely on the task at hand. He couldn't afford distractions. Each step forward brought them closer to their target. He could feel the Zorkari commander's desperation in the air. They had underestimated the humans' resolve, and now they were paying the price. It wasn't just about firepower anymore. It was about precision. Elias's team moved like shadows, cutting through enemy lines with surgical precision. Explosives were planted on key structures, and Zorkari troops were scattered, caught between the two forces. Their communication was in chaos, their systems crashing under the weight of human innovation. As the Zorkari command center came into view, Elias could see the frantic movements of their leadership trying to rally their forces. But it was too late. The humans had them where they wanted them. Inside the command center, Elias entered the main control room. It was filled with Zorkari officers, all of them frantically working at their stations. They looked up in shock as Elias and his team stormed in. One of the officers, a high-ranking Zorkari, rose from his seat, his mandibles clenching. You think you've won? This is only a temporary setback. You cannot stop the Zorkari. Elias advanced, his eyes cold. You should have understood by now, Zorkari. Humanity doesn't stop. We don't just fight to survive, we fight to win. With that, he gave the signal. Explosives detonated throughout the base, collapsing the command center. The Zorkari officers scrambled, but it was clear they were too late. Their leadership had been decimated in an instant. As the dust settled, Elias surveyed the destruction. The Zorkari were in disarray. Their command had fallen. For the first time in the war, humanity had delivered a decisive blow. Mara approached, her face a mix of relief and satisfaction. "You did it. We did it." Elias took one last look at the shattered command center. "This is only the beginning. We've shown them what happens when they underestimate us. Now, we finish what we started." The war wasn't over, but for the first time in a long while, Elias felt the tide had finally turned in humanity's favor.